When most people think about IRA attacks in London, their minds instinctively turn to the 1970s and 80s. The bombing campaigns, the news footage, the absolute terror that gripped the city for decades.
It couldn't have been worse time. Halfway through Harrods' busiest Saturday of Christmas shoppers, with thousands of staff and customers in the store. There had been a warning, but Harrods could find no bomb inside. That the casualties were not even greater may have been due to their decision not to evacuate the store until after the bomb went off. Had they told people to leave, there could have been very large crowds in the vicinity of the car containing the bomb, which the police were even then fatally investigating.
There was a panic there.
How were people reacting?
Very angry.
Angry?
Very angry, yes. And they were scared, of course, but at the same time they were very angry, you know.
I'm from Northern Ireland, and it really upset me. I mean, well, that's where I come from, Ireland, and it sort of really shook, it really shook me up. So
everybody was nervous and scared and didn't know what was going to happen or anything.
But it was very horrible.
Yes, horrible, really. I was.
That reaction is entirely understandable, given that those events remain within living memory for many watching this. But the IRA were carrying out assassinations and coordinated attacks on the streets of London more than 100 years ago, murders that have never been solved, cases that were quietly forgotten, and victims whose names have all but vanished from public memory. Today, we are going back to 1921, a year when Ireland was tearing itself apart in a brutal war for independence. And that violence spilled onto the streets of the British capital in ways that most history books failed to acknowledge. There are two murders to examine here. The first involves a young man found shot dead on a golf course with a chilling note pinned to his body. The second concerns a completely innocent railway worker who was gunned down on his own doorstep by masked men who had come looking for someone else entirely. Both cases remain officially unsolved to this day, and after spending weeks researching this subject, the reasons for that become disturbingly clear. Before exploring the actual murders, it is essential to understand what was happening at the time, because without that context, none of this will make proper sense. In 1921, Ireland and Britain were effectively at war, though the British government never actually declared it as such, because doing so would have meant acknowledging that the Irish had a legitimate cause. Instead, they called it a police action and labelled the IRA a murder gang, pretending it was merely criminals causing trouble rather than an organised military campaign for independence. But make no mistake, it was a war, a nasty, brutal guerrilla conflict that would reshape the political landscape of both nations. In 1916, during the middle of the First World War, a group of Irish Republicans launched what became known as the Easter Rising, seizing key buildings in Dublin, including the General Post Office, and proclaiming an independent Irish Republic. The whole affair lasted about a week before British forces crushed it. And here is where the British made a catastrophic mistake. Instead of treating the rebel leaders with some degree of leniency, they executed them. 14 men were shot by a firing squad over the following days, and one of them, James Connolly, was so badly wounded from the fighting that he could not even stand. They strapped him to a chair before they shot him. Before the Rising, most ordinary Irish people were not particularly supportive of armed rebellion. They wanted some form of self-governance, certainly, but outright revolution seemed extreme to most. Those executions changed everything. Public opinion in Ireland swung dramatically towards the nationalist cause. By the time of the general election in December 1918, the Republican Party Sinn Féin won a landslide victory in Ireland, taking 73 out of 105 seats. Instead of taking their seats in the British Parliament at Westminster, they refused to go. meeting instead in Dublin in January 1919 and declaring themselves the Parliament of an independent Irish Republic, the Dáil Éireann. The British, unsurprisingly, were not pleased about this development. On the 21st of January 1919, the same day the Dáil first met, members of the Irish Republican Army ambushed and killed 2 Royal Irish Constabulary officers in County Tipperary while they were escorting a cart of explosives to a quarry. This is generally considered the first action of what became known as the Irish War of Independence. The IRA at this time was led by a man called Michael Collins, who was only about 28 or 29 years old, but proved himself absolutely brilliant at what he did. Serving as the Director of Intelligence for the IRA, Collins built up an espionage network that ran rings around the British. Collins had spies everywhere, typists working in Dublin Castle, policemen who had grown disillusioned with the Crown, and even prison warders who helped Republican prisoners escape. He also formed a special unit called the Squad, sometimes known as the 12 Apostles, hand-picked men whose job was simple: assassinate British intelligence officers and anyone who informed on the IRA. Collins had a rule. He would give targets a warning first. Stop what you are doing and get out, or face the consequences. Some took the hint and resigned or transferred away. Those who did not found the Squad would come for them. The most dramatic operation carried out by the Squad was Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November, 1920. That morning, IRA units struck at over 20 different locations across Dublin, targeting British intelligence officers who had been identified by Collins's spy network. 14 British agents were killed and 6 more wounded, a devastating blow to British intelligence operations in Ireland. The British response that same afternoon was horrific. A mixed force of soldiers, black and tans and auxiliaries, raided a Gaelic football match at Croke Park Stadium and opened fire on the crowd. 14 civilians were killed, including one of the players, and dozens more were wounded. That night, 2 IRA commanders who had helped plan the morning's assassinations were captured and killed in Dublin Castle. The authorities claimed they were shot while trying to escape, though nobody believed that. Bloody Sunday showed the war at its most brutal, and understanding this context is crucial when examining the London murders. This was not some abstract political dispute. It was a vicious, dirty conflict where both sides committed atrocities. The war was fought not in set-piece battles like the trenches of France, but through urban guerrilla warfare, ambushes, assassinations, and hit-and-run attacks where the IRA would strike and then melt back into the civilian population. The British response was heavy-handed, to put it mildly. By early 1920, the Royal Irish Constabulary was in serious trouble. Officers were being killed, wounded, or intimidated into resigning at an alarming rate. And recruitment in Ireland had essentially collapsed because anyone who joined the police was marked as a legitimate target by the IRA. The British government devised a solution. They started recruiting men in Britain, mainly ex-soldiers and veterans of the First World War, who were struggling to find work in the post-war economy. They were offered 10 shillings a day, which was decent money at the time, to go to Ireland and face a rough and dangerous task. About 9,500 men signed up. There was a shortage of proper police uniforms, so these new recruits were kitted out in a mix of dark police tunics and khaki military trousers. The combination reminded people of the colours of a famous pack of foxhounds from Limerick called the Scarteen Black and Tans, and that is how they got their nickname. What followed was brutal. The Black and Tans became notorious for reprisals. When the IRA killed one of their own, they would often respond by attacking civilian communities, burning homes, shops, and entire town centres. In September 1920, After the IRA killed 2 policemen in Balbriggan, the Black and Tans went on the rampage, destroying dozens of homes and businesses and killing 2 local men, an incident that became known as the Sack of Balbriggan. Similar reprisals struck Tuam, Trim, Templemore and Thurles, and the worst of it came in December 1920 when Cork city centre was burned by British forces. These actions were counterproductive. Every reprisal pushed more Irish people towards supporting the IRA, and even moderate nationalists who would have been content with some form of home rule within the British Empire were radicalised by what they witnessed. British public opinion also started to turn, with reports from Ireland making people deeply uncomfortable. The Labour Party produced a damning report, Liberal politicians spoke out, and even some Conservatives began questioning whether this was really what Britain should be doing. This is where the story truly begins. The IRA leadership made a decision. If Britain was going to wage war in Ireland, then the Irish would bring the war to Britain. There was already a significant Irish community living in British cities. In 1921, about 1 in 3 Irish-born people lived abroad, and a huge proportion of them resided in places like London, Liverpool, Manchester and Glasgow, with many sympathetic to the independence cause. An organisation called the Irish Self-Determination League of Great Britain had been established in 1919, and at its peak, it boasted nearly 40,000 members across hundreds of branches, holding public meetings, publishing newspapers, raising funds, and lobbying for Irish independence through legitimate political channels. But there was also a more clandestine network, IRA volunteers in Britain, who gathered intelligence, smuggled weapons back to Ireland, and, when the order came, carried out operations on British soil. By 1921, there were over 2,500 IRA volunteers in Britain, and their activities ranged from what one commander called pinpricks to more serious operations. They cut telegraph wires, set fire to businesses, raided premises, and even attacked farms and warehouses storing goods bound for Ireland. And they planned assassinations. Michael Collins himself had lived in London before the war, working as a clerk in the Post Office Savings Bank. He knew the city, understood how it operated, and had contacts there. The IRA in London studied potential targets, like film stars, tracking the movements of British intelligence officers, politicians, and military figures, looking for vulnerabilities, waiting for the right moment. On the morning of Sunday, the 3rd of April, 1921, a young caddie named George Tyrrell was walking across the golf links at Ashford, probably just getting ready for the day ahead, when he spotted something odd. A man lying on the grass near the 14th bunker. Tyrrell called over to another caddie, and they approached cautiously. The man was dead. The police were summoned, along with a local doctor named Walker, who examined the body and determined that the man had been dead for at least 6 hours, probably longer, killed during the night. A proper post-mortem conducted by the police surgeon, Dr. Francis Thompson, told a grim story. The victim had been shot multiple times, with a bullet wound on the right side of his body and 2 more wounds in his back. At least one of those shots had been fired from very close range, just a few feet away. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. Near the body, the caddies had found something else. 4 spent bullet casings on the road nearby, and a piece of paper bearing a chilling message. It read, "Let all spies and traitors beware. IRA." At first, the police had no idea who this man was. He was young, maybe 20 or 21, though he looked older, about 5'8" or 9, with a pale complexion, dark brown hair, a slight moustache, and grey eyes. His teeth were distinctive, with the second tooth from the centre of his upper jaw missing. He was wearing a blue serge suit, a white soft collar, a black tie with gold stripes, and a heliotrope shirt, that is a sort of light purple colour. He had a velour hat made by a company called Dulcis. The police circulated this description, hoping someone would come forward, and eventually someone did. A woman identified only as Francis told the court that the victim was her cousin. His name was Vincent Fovarque. He was 20 years old, and he worked as a clerk and bookkeeper. She had last seen him alive on the evening of Saturday the 2nd of April, sometime between 6:30 and 6:45. An inquest was opened on the 6th of April, but was quickly adjourned, as the police needed more time to investigate. They needed to find out who Vincent Fovarque really was, and why the IRA had apparently marked him as a spy. When the inquest resumed on the 20th of April, the atmosphere was extraordinarily tense. 7 people involved in the inquiry, including members of the jury, had received threatening letters, warning that if a certain verdict was reached, their relatives would be killed. The police took charge of these letters, but the message was clear. Someone did not want this case examined too closely. 2 witnesses gave evidence about Fovarque's movements before his death. The first was Matthew Patrick Higgins, a young clerk who had previously served in the Irish Guards and had been the secretary of the Irish Self-Determination League from December 1920 until March 1921. He knew Fovarque, though not by that name. Higgins told the court that Fovarque had introduced himself as Richard Stanton and had first appeared at Kelvedon Hall in Fulham, where the League held Saturday dances, back in February 1921. Higgins had seen him again at a League meeting at Fulham Town Hall on the 16th of February. On the fatal evening of Saturday the 2nd of April, Fovarque had been at another dance at Kelvedon Hall. Higgins remembered seeing him at about 8:15 that evening, talking to some men in the outer lobby, though he did not know who those men were and did not see them leave together. One thing Higgins was clear about: Fovarque had never actually joined the League. He came to events, but he was not a member. The second witness was Michael MacDonald, who had been the League's assistant secretary since January 1921. He confirmed that a red ticket found on the deceased's body was a dance ticket from the event on the 2nd of April, and he had seen Fovarque at the hall that night, though he noticed the young man was not dancing. The detective inspector who had been investigating the case, a man named Smith, had to admit he had found no evidence that would lead to identifying the killers. The jury returned the only verdict they could: willful murder against some person or persons unknown. So who was Vincent Fovarque, and why did the IRA kill him? Based on the evidence, it seems clear that Fovarque was some kind of informer or agent. The fact that he used aliases, that he attended League events without actually joining, and that he was seen talking to unidentified men just before his disappearance all suggest he was gathering intelligence. The most likely answer is that he was working for British intelligence. The government had a network of agents and informers trying to penetrate Republican organisations, and Fovarque fits the profile: young, able to move in Irish circles without raising too much suspicion, collecting information about who attended meetings and what was discussed. If the IRA discovered he was passing information to the authorities, the consequences were inevitable. What seems to have occurred is this: Fovarque attended the dance on the evening of Saturday the 2nd of April. At some point, he was approached by men who had identified him as a spy. They took him from the hall, drove him out to the isolated golf course at Ashford, and shot him. The note left with his body was not just a message to the police, it was a warning to anyone else who might be thinking of informing on the IRA. What is particularly striking about this case is the threatening letters sent to the jurors and witnesses. That is not something amateurs do. It is organised, systematic, and indicates that whoever killed Vincent Fovarque had a support network in London capable of identifying who was involved in the inquest and delivering intimidating messages to their homes. Fovarque's murder was not the end of IRA activity in London. Far from it. On the weekend of the 14th and 15th of May, 1921, the IRA launched a coordinated campaign of attacks across the city. These were not random. They were targeted specifically at people who had relatives serving with the Crown forces in Ireland. The attacks took place in Catford, Shepherd's Bush, Blackheath, Tooting, Battersea, and West Kensington. Some involved arson attempts, while others involved something far worse. At about 9:45 on the evening of Saturday the 14th of May, a gang of 5 masked men arrived at an address in Stowe Road, asking for a man named Birthright, who had once been a member of the Royal Irish Constabulary. He was not home. The men were not deterred. They produced what they claimed was a warrant for his arrest and tried to set fire to the house using paraffin they had brought with them. Fortunately, the flames were quickly extinguished, and when neighbours started calling for the police, the men fled. But their night was not over. The gang's next stop was a house in Bloemfontein Road, Shepherd's Bush, the home of Horace Macneil, a 47-year-old railway engineer's foreman. He lived there with his wife and was by all accounts a decent, hard-working man who had served his engineering apprenticeship at Thornycroft's works in Chiswick and was well known and well liked in the local area. His estate would later be valued at £174, 4 shillings and 10 pence, which tells you he was reasonably comfortable, but by no means wealthy. At about 10 o'clock that evening, Macneil and his wife were getting ready for bed when there was a knock at the front door. Macneil answered it. Standing on his doorstep were 4 men, fairly well dressed but terrifying in appearance, all wearing masks or goggles to conceal their faces and visibly armed. The men asked to see a Mr. Corneys, Macneil's son-in-law, who had served in Ireland for a few months and was currently in the motor transport section of the Royal Irish Constabulary. But he did not live at that address. Macneil explained this. "Corneys does not live here. You have made a mistake." The men were not satisfied. They asked where Corns could be found, and as they were asking, 2 of them edged their way into the hallway. Macneil tried to close the front door, but he could not. What happened next was described in statements Macneil gave before he died. He said, "I went to the door and saw 4 men. I told them they had made a mistake, but one of them said, 'I'm sure we have not made a mistake. I'm going to shoot.' Another of them then said, 'Shoot low.' I cannot describe any of them." And in another account, "I tried to push them out of the door and one said, 'I'll shoot.' The other man said, 'No,' and one man said, 'Shoot low.' I saw 4 men all together. The one that fired was about 30 and 5 foot 8 inches. I think he was clean-shaven, dark clothes, and a soft felt hat. I thought it was a drunken affair, nothing like this." Macneil was shot in the abdomen and fell backwards into his wife's arms. The gang's leader was referred to by the others as Captain, and all of the attackers appeared to be Irish, judging by their accents. The 4 intruders then fled in the direction of Uxbridge Road, leaving behind 2 revolvers and 2 bottles of petrol, an American Colt revolver and a British Army-issue revolver containing 9 cartridges between them. 3 bullets had been fired. At least one neighbour witnessed the gang leaving but could not describe them in any useful detail. They were young men wearing dark clothing, and that was all. Horace Macneil was rushed to the West London Hospital and operated on immediately for perforation of the bowels. Initially, there were hopes he would survive. He did not. On the morning of Wednesday, the 18th of May, 4 days after the attack, Horace Macneil died of bronchial pneumonia following his gunshot injury. A completely innocent man, killed on his own doorstep by men who were looking for someone else. After shooting Macneil, the gang visited one more address, a house in Fairholme Road, West Kensington. They were looking for a Captain Wood, who was away serving in Ireland. Once again, their target was not home. The men pushed their way inside anyway, searched the house, and before leaving, attempted to set it on fire. Like their earlier arson attempt, this one was largely unsuccessful. The gang's leader, once again, had an Irish accent. 3 attacks in one night, 1 attempted arson, 1 shooting that would prove fatal, and another attempted arson, all targeting people connected to the British forces in Ireland. This was terrorism, plain and simple. The IRA had brought their war to London. The inquest into Horace Macneil's death began at Hammersmith on the 21st of May, 1921, and the atmosphere was extraordinary. Police guarded the entrance to the court. No one was allowed inside without a permit, and the coroner urged the press to exercise the utmost discretion in printing the names and addresses of witnesses. The reason for all this caution was simple. People were terrified. Contemporary reports noted that witnesses were practically paralyzed by fear. Just as in the Fovarque case, the shadow of the IRA hung heavy over the court, and ordinary Londoners were terrified that if they spoke up, they would be next. Mrs. Macneil was the principal witness. Her testimony was heartbreakingly simple. Horace had no connection to Irish politics. He had no enemies, and his only link to the conflict was a son-in-law he rarely saw. She corroborated the terrifying details of the attack, the masked men, the confusing demands, and the weapons they made no attempt to hide. Crucially, she confirmed that despite the disguises, the men were young and spoke with Irish accents. Another witness recalled hearing a sound like an explosion and seeing 3 men running from the house. They split up as they fled, some going down Rainsbury Road and others down Ellerslie Road, and they may have escaped in a waiting motor car. The jury had no choice but to return a verdict of willful murder against persons unknown. Horace Macneil was buried on the 23rd of May, 1921. The funeral was a remarkable display of public sympathy and solidarity. The cortege started at the family home, led by 2 mounted policemen with hundreds of railway workers, Macneil's colleagues, following behind. 3 carriages carried the family, and hundreds of onlookers lined the funeral route. Wreaths poured in from different people and organisations. The police investigation went nowhere. Despite the physical evidence left at the scene, despite witness accounts, no one was ever arrested for Horace Macneil's murder. The following year, a review of London crimes in 1921 noted, "It will be seen that the only 2 unsolved cases in the metropolitan area were political in origin, and there is no class of crime more difficult to track down, because there is no strong line leading to any one individual. Political crimes, that is what they called them. And the police were right. These were not ordinary murders motivated by money or passion or personal grievance. These were acts of war. The killers were soldiers, in their own minds at least, fighting for a cause, and they had support networks, safe houses, and people who would hide them and lie for them. Finding them was virtually impossible. The police did take action in the wake of these attacks, raiding the headquarters of the Irish Self-Determination League on Shaftesbury Avenue, where they found papers, some written in Irish, some in code. 12 men and 4 women were arrested in London. The authorities believed the gunmen themselves had come over from Ireland, specifically, to carry out these attacks, and were helped in London by sympathisers, many of them women, who provided accommodation, information, and logistical support. Police began offering protection to relatives of people serving with the armed forces in Ireland, for the threat was real and ongoing, and the violence did not stop. Just over a month later, on the 22nd of June 1922, another high-profile assassination took place in London. Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, who had been the chief of the Imperial General Staff and was serving as a Unionist MP and security advisor to the Northern Ireland government, was shot dead on the doorstep of his home in Belgravia. His assassins were Reginald Dunn and Joseph O'Sullivan, two IRA volunteers who had both served in the British Army during the First World War. O'Sullivan had lost a leg at Passchendaele. Both men were captured, tried, and hanged in August 1922. The Wilson assassination was the first killing of a sitting MP in London since Prime Minister Spencer Perceval in 1812. It caused an international sensation and may have been one of the triggers for the Irish Civil War that followed. Just 2 months after Horace Macneil's murder, a truce was declared between the IRA and British forces on the 11th of July 1921. Both sides were exhausted. Around 1,500 people had died, 6,000 Republicans had been imprisoned, and the IRA was running short of weapons and manpower, while British public opinion was turning against the violence. The truce led to formal peace talks in London, with Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith meeting British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. In December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, establishing the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Empire, with Northern Ireland given the option to remain part of the United Kingdom. The treaty was controversial, and the split over it led to the Irish Civil War beginning in June 1922. Michael Collins himself was killed in an ambush that August, just 10 months after signing the treaty. By the time the treaty was signed, the murders of Vincent Fovarque and Horace Macneil had become historical footnotes. The political landscape had transformed, the IRA was splitting and reforming, and the men who carried out the London attacks had either died, been imprisoned, returned to Ireland, or simply disappeared into civilian life. There was no longer the political will or practical means to pursue these cold cases. So why were these murders never solved? First, there was the nature of the crimes themselves. These were politically motivated killings carried out by an organized guerrilla movement with a sophisticated support network. The killers had help before, during, and after the attacks. They had places to hide, people who would provide alibis, and an entire community that, whether through sympathy or fear, would not cooperate with the British authorities. Second, there was the climate of terror. People were genuinely afraid that if they came forward with information, they or their families would be targeted, and that fear was entirely rational given what was happening. Third, there was the passage of time. The War of Independence ended with a truce in July 1921, just 2 months after Macneil's murder. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December of that year, establishing the Irish Free State, and with the political situation transformed, the urgency to solve these cases faded. The killers, whoever they were, likely returned to Ireland or simply melted back into civilian life. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, these killings achieved their purpose. They spread fear. They demonstrated that the long arm of the IRA could reach into the heart of London, and they sent a message that no one connected to British rule in Ireland was safe, no matter where they lived. From the IRA's perspective, whether the individual operatives were ever caught was almost secondary to the psychological impact of the attacks. The IRA campaign in Britain during the War of Independence was relatively limited compared to what would come later. Contemporary accounts describe most of the operations as pinpricks rather than major attacks, with around 239 operations before the truce, most involving sabotage rather than assassination. But even these limited attacks had a significant impact. The newspapers, as one IRA volunteer remembered, played up our little acts considerably, and every telegraph wire cut, every warehouse burned, every shooting made headlines and contributed to a growing sense that the situation in Ireland was spiralling out of control. The IRA campaign in Britain was controversial even within Republican circles. Some argued that attacks on the British mainland alienated potential supporters, while others felt it was the only way to make the government take notice. For the families of Vincent Fovarque and Horace Macneil, these historical debates were cold comfort. Their loved ones were dead, and no one would ever be held accountable. Now, over 100 years later, what can we make of these cases? First, they remind us that the conflict between Ireland and Britain has very deep roots. The troubles of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s did not come out of nowhere. They were the continuation of a struggle that had been going on for centuries. Second, these cases show us the human cost of political violence. Horace Macneil was not a combatant, nor was he even a supporter of British policy in Ireland. He was just a railway worker who happened to have a son-in-law in the RIC. His death served no military purpose. It was simply terror for terror's sake. And Vincent Fovarque, whoever he really was a 20-year-old man. Perhaps he was passing information to the authorities. Perhaps he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. Or perhaps he was just trying to earn some extra money. We will never know. But he ended up shot dead on a golf course with a threatening note pinned to his body. Third, these cases remind us why political violence rarely achieves its aims cleanly. Yes, Ireland eventually won its independence, but the methods used left wounds that took generations to heal. The cycle of violence and reprisal, assassination and counter-assassination, created a legacy of bitterness that would echo down the decades. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 finally brought an end to the worst of the violence, but even now, more than 25 years on, the scars remain. Before asking what happened to the killers, it is worth understanding the world they operated in. Irish people had been coming to Britain for work for generations, and by 1921, entire neighbourhoods in London were predominantly Irish. Areas like Camden Town, Kilburn and Hammersmith had thriving Irish communities with their own churches, pubs and cultural organisations. Most of these people were ordinary working folk who had come to Britain because that was where the jobs were. The Irish Self-Determination League provided a political home for those who wanted independence, but were not prepared to take up arms. While within this community, there was also a more militant element, IRA volunteers who had come specifically to conduct operations. This is what made the IRA so difficult to combat. They did not stand out. They looked like everyone else, worked normal jobs, had normal lives. And then, when the order became soldiers. The British authorities struggled to penetrate this world, and crucially, the ordinary Irish community, even those who might not have supported violence, were unlikely to help the British police after centuries of colonial rule, the executions of the Easter Rising leaders, and the Black and Tans. This wall of silence protected the killers, and it is probably why they were never caught. This is the question that hangs over both cases. Who were the men who killed Vincent Fovarque and Horace Macneil, and what happened to them? The honest answer is that we do not know. The most likely scenario is that they were IRA volunteers who used the Republican support network to escape after carrying out the attacks, returning to Ireland, staying in Britain under assumed identities, or emigrating to America or Australia. If they survived the Irish Civil War, they might have lived out their lives as ordinary citizens. Some former IRA men went into politics, some became respected members of their communities, and some never spoke of what they had done. These men believed they were soldiers fighting a just war, and the people they killed were not murder victims in their eyes. They were enemy combatants or collaborators who had chosen the wrong side. Whether you accept that framing depends on your perspective on Irish history, and the legitimacy of armed resistance to colonial rule, but it helps explain why the killers, whoever they were, probably never felt the need to confess or come forward. The IRA attacks in London in 1921 were largely forgotten in the years that followed. They were overshadowed by the drama of the treaty negotiations, the bitter split in the Republican movement, the Civil War, and the establishment of the Irish Free State. When people think of IRA violence in London, they think of the later campaigns, the bombings of the 1970s, the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, the Brighton hotel bombing that nearly killed Margaret Thatcher, and the Bishopsgate and Docklands bombs of the 1990s. But the 1921 attacks were the precedent. They established that the IRA was willing and able to strike at the heart of the British capital, and they showed that no one connected to Ireland was safe. The book used for this research, Unsolved London Murders by Jonathan Oates, rescued these cases from obscurity. Oates went through police files, newspaper archives, and contemporary accounts to piece together what happened, and without his work, these stories might have been lost entirely. There is value in remembering them, not to glorify the violence or to take sides in a conflict that still evokes strong emotions, but simply to acknowledge that these events happened, that real people died, that families were left grieving, and that justice was never done. So, there it is, the forgotten IRA murders of 1921. Vincent Fovarque, a young man with aliases and secrets, shot dead on a golf course in Ashford with a warning note from the IRA. Horace Macneil, an innocent railway worker, gunned down on his doorstep by masked men searching for his son-in-law. Both cases remain officially unsolved to this day, and barring some extraordinary discovery in the archives, they probably always will be. What strikes most about these cases, after all this research, is how ordinary the victims were. Fovarque was just a young man in his early 20s, and Macneil was a middle-aged worker looking forward to retirement. They were not generals or politicians or master spies, they were simply people. And that is the tragedy of political violence. The people who suffer most are rarely the ones making the decisions. They are the ordinary folk who get caught up in events beyond their control. If you have made it this far, thank you for watching. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think these cases could ever be solved? Do you know anything about the IRA campaign in Britain during this period? And if you want to learn more about unsolved historical crimes, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, take care of yourselves.